The city of Susa woke beneath the shadow of the Persian palace, one of the centers of the most powerful empire in the world. Inside those walls lived Queen Esther. She wore a crown. She lived in the palace. But there was something the king and many around her did not know. Esther was Jewish, and now a royal decree had gone out across the empire, an order that threatened the lives of her people. Messengers carried the decree from province to province. The news spread quickly. For the Jewish people, what had been an ordinary day suddenly became a day of fear and uncertainty. Outside the palace gate, Esther's cousin Mordecai heard the news. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and cried out bitterly. The danger was real, and somewhere behind the walls of the palace was a woman who might be able to do something about it. When Esther's attendants told her that Mordecai was mourning outside the palace, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him, but Mordecai refused it. Esther needed to know what had happened, so she sent Hathach, one of the king's attendants assigned to her, to speak with Mordecai. Mordecai explained everything. He told Hathach about Haman's plan. He gave him a copy of the written decree and asked him to show it to Esther, and Mordecai sent a message with it. Esther must go to the king. She must plead for her people. But Esther knew something Mordecai knew too. No one simply walked into the king's presence. Persian law said that anyone who entered the inner court without being summoned could be put to death, unless the king extended his golden scepter, and Esther had not been called to see the king for 30 days. She sent that message back to Mordecai. This was not cowardice. Esther understood the cost of what she was being asked to do. Then Mordecai answered with words that would define this moment in her life. He warned Esther not to believe that living in the palace would guarantee her safety. And then he said, "Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther had not chosen this crisis, but perhaps she had been placed exactly where she was for a purpose she could not have seen beforehand. Something changed in Esther. She made her decision. She sent word to Mordecai, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are present in Susa, and fast for me. Don't eat or drink 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast the same way. Then I will go in to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther did not suddenly know how everything would turn out. She simply knew what faithfulness required of her next. Across Susa, her people fasted. Inside the palace, Esther and her attendants did the same. Then the 3rd day came. Esther put on her royal clothing and entered the inner court of the king's palace. The king sat on his throne. Esther stood where he could see her. For one suspended moment, everything depended on what happened next. Then the king saw Esther. She obtained favor in his sight, and he held out the golden scepter. Esther stepped forward and touched its top. The king asked what troubled her and what she wanted. He even told her that her request would be granted. But Esther did not immediately reveal Haman's plot. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. Esther had found the courage to enter the court. Now she would need the wisdom to know when to speak. At the banquet, the king again asked Esther what she wanted. Still, Esther waited. She invited the king and Haman to return for another banquet the following day. Then, she promised, she would answer the king's question. Haman left the palace delighted. He had been invited to dine with the king and queen. But as he passed the palace gate, he saw Mordecai. Mordecai would not rise or tremble before him. Haman's pride turned his joy into rage. At home, he boasted about his wealth, his position, and the honor of being invited to Esther's banquet. Yet none of it satisfied him while Mordecai remained at the king's gate. So a plan was made to have Mordecai killed. It appeared that the danger was becoming even greater. But that night, something happened that Haman could never have planned for. The king could not sleep. He ordered the book of royal records to be brought and read to him. There, in the record, was the account of how Mordecai had once uncovered a plot against the king's life. The king asked what honor had been given to Mordecai for what he had done. The answer was simple: nothing. Then Haman entered the court, intending to ask permission to have Mordecai executed. Before Haman could make his request, the king asked him a question. What shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman assumed the king meant him, so he described an extravagant public honor, royal clothing, the king's horse, and a procession through the city. Then came the command Haman never expected. The king told him to do exactly that for Mordecai. The man Haman wanted destroyed was publicly honored, and Haman himself had to lead the procession. The story had begun to turn. The time came for Esther's second banquet. Again, the king asked for her request. This time Esther spoke. She asked the king to spare her life and the lives of her people. She told him that she and her people had been sold to be destroyed. The king demanded to know who would dare to do such a thing. Esther answered, "A foe and an enemy, even this wicked Haman." Haman was exposed. The king rose in anger. The man who had seemed so powerful suddenly stood powerless before the consequences of his own scheme. Haman's plot against Mordecai and the Jewish people collapsed, and the very gallows Haman had prepared for Mordecai became the place of his own downfall. But Esther's work was not finished. The original decree still threatened her people. Esther again went before the king and pleaded with him. The king gave Esther and Mordecai authority to write a new decree in his name. Mordecai summoned the king's scribes. Letters were written and sealed with the king's ring. Royal couriers hurried throughout the empire, carrying the news. The Jewish people were now given the right to defend themselves against those who sought to destroy them. And Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing royal garments. The man who had mourned outside the palace gate now walked out in honor. When the people of Susa saw him, the city rejoiced. The fear that had once spread through the Jewish communities was replaced by something entirely different. Esther 8:16 says, "The Jews had light, gladness, joy, and honor. There were feasts, there was celebration, there was relief. Families who had wondered what would become of them could now rejoice together." The story that began with mourning ended with gladness. The woman who once wondered whether she could risk entering the king's court had become the person through whom an entire people were helped. Esther could not see any of this when Mordecai first sent his message. She could not see the sleepless night that would cause the king to remember Mordecai. She could not see Haman's pride turning against him. She could not see the new decree. She could not yet hear the celebration that would eventually fill Susa. She only knew that the moment in front of her required courage. That is one of the great truths in Esther's story. We do not always know why God has placed us where we are. Sometimes the opportunity in front of us may look ordinary. Sometimes doing the right thing may require courage. Sometimes we may feel unqualified for the moment that has found us, but Esther reminds us that our lives are not meaningless collections of circumstances. There are moments when the position we hold, the experience we have, the people we know, or even the place where we happen to be, can become an opportunity to do something good. We may never stand before a Persian king, but we will have moments when someone needs us to speak. Moments when doing nothing would be easier. Moments when kindness requires action. Moments when faith asks us to take one courageous step before we know how the story will end. And perhaps, in one of those moments, we may discover what Esther discovered. We were there for a reason. Esther's story did not end with fear. It ended with light, gladness, joy, honor, and people celebrating a deliverance they once could not imagine. So when God places an opportunity in front of you, do not assume you are there by accident. You may not see what He is doing yet. You may not know how one faithful decision will affect someone else. But courage does not require seeing the entire ending. Sometimes it simply means being faithful in the moment God has placed before you. Because who knows, perhaps you too are where you are for such a time as this.